Welcome to this virtual open house to discuss the residential code initiatives under consideration by the city. We're really happy to have all of you with us. And now that we've given it a couple minutes for people to trickle in, we will kick things off. So I'm Amanda Beck. I am a planner in the Long Range Planning Division, and I'm joined by my colleague Nate Gwynn, who is also a long range planner with the city. This open house and the one we're holding this Thursday from 4 to 5:30 is to gather input from you on the proposed code amendments. Public comments will be shared with the Plan Commission and City Council to guide the City Council's ultimate decision on draft revisions to code. We'd also like to keep you informed about upcoming opportunities to share comments or hear updates on the project. So the project webpage at myspokanecity.org/projects/shaping Spokane housing is the clearinghouse for information on all of the code amendments. There's 7 of them. When we have draft text available, you'll find it there. If you want to watch a past presentation, we'll have links to those as well. And the webpage is noted on the screen, just in case I didn't say that clearly enough. So the agenda today is to run through a quick introduction. Then we will talk about new residential development, such as accessory dwelling units, and wrap that up with a question and answer session that's particularly about those code amendments. And then we will go into the second part, which will be about permit processes, such as the environmental review threshold, and then wrap that up with a question and answer session as well. So we've tried to leave the bulk of time to address people's questions, concerns, comments, and then we will direct you back to the website and some upcoming events that we have. Nate, did you want to add anything?
Oh, no, thanks. I think that's, that covers the agenda.
All right. Well, I will hand it back over to Nate to do the introduction on this code amendment.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. I think this would be a good point to kind of acknowledge who's in the room and do a quick poll. So I'm going to try to, looks like, am I able to do this? Maybe I'll have to, try working that out, and maybe we can come back to that. But I do want to acknowledge looks like 23 folks in attendance, and thanks so much for your time, for being here. Again, I'm Nathan Gwynn, and I am going to go ahead and try to share my screen. So looking at the guiding documents for this effort, we are following the comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2001 for the city of Spokane. This had input from hundreds of citizens and does have annual amendments since 2001. And this amendment cycle is really built in and gives guides timing of development code proposals, along with an 8-year periodic update cycle. And the last periodic update was in 2017. That involved public engagement activities and policy focus groups to update the individual chapters in the plan, including the land use and housing elements of the plan. And that was the Shaping Spokane update in 2017. The plan's next update is due in 2026. And the Housing Action Plan, so these documents indicated on the right of the screen, that was adopted last year. And these related documents, they spelled out several actions that address the current housing affordability crisis in Spokane and the region, with priority on increasing housing supply. Yes? And excuse me, and the city's share of these actions are still under the proposal. They're still under. Uh, there's pieces of those actions that are still under the umbrella of the Shaping Spokane comprehensive plan. So I just wanted to give you a guide of the framework that we're looking at and give more context in terms of the first phase of these amendments that we discussed today. They're only some of the pieces from the Housing Action Plan and those related documents. And so only about a quarter of the 17 overall strategies from the Housing Action Plan that you may be familiar with. And thinking of that as a continuum of thinking of housing options as a continuum of different types. The graphic at the top of the screen represents the range of single family and some of the different housing types in Spokane, while the bottom shows and highlights some of the housing types of focus for more flexibility in development forms for these first phase amendments that we're discussing today. So it gives you an idea of which housing types are of focus in terms of these amendments. Can single families still be built? Yes, single family homes could still be built everywhere they're allowed now, and Spokane is very permissive in terms of where single family homes can be built. But the change for appearance of some, or in some cases where other types are allowed is really the focus. Just looking quickly at past residential code amendments since the 2006 residential code that was adopted to implement the comprehensive plan. That introduced cottage housing, detached accessory dwelling units, which we'll talk about more later, as well as attached housing. That was followed in 2012 by adjustments under the Infill Housing Task Force. Following that task force meeting for compact zoning in residential single family, limitations on garage walls and pocket residential development in some zones. And then 2014 for unit lot subdivision, and 2018 and 2019, the infill development code revisions further changed cottage housing, pocket residential, added compact lots to the residential single family zones, and also contained modifications to attached homes and height exceptions in some higher density zones such as residential multifamily and residential high density. And you can find more information about those amendments on the city's project webpage under infill housing strategies. So looking at the proposed amendments today, so following the agenda that Amanda outlined, we'll give a background for each topic and then discuss, and we're emphasizing phase one now, and the amendments proposed include for new residential development, more flexibility for types like duplexes and attached housing, and then for streamlining permitting processes like subdivisions up to 9 lots and review thresholds under the State Environmental Policy Act. Those are more short-term and mid-term proposals that were informed by the Housing Action Plan, while the longer-term changes are coming in phase two. And those longer-term changes may require more major development code changes or comprehensive plan amendments. So for the proposed amendments today, again, we'll start with new residential development, look at accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and attached homes. And then not a housing type, but lot size transitions, how the new lots can be laid out in new development. And then following that quick presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A with the group and get your input and your take on these proposals. And then we'll about 10 minutes to 1, we'll go back to the topics shown on the right, which cover permit processes to accommodate residential and other development. So starting with new residential development and those housing types, and starting with accessory dwelling units. What makes them accessory is that sometimes they're called a second unit, or mother-in-law suite, or granny flat, and they're secondary to the primary single-family dwelling. So you can see they're the smaller units that are indicated here in the purple shade. They're limited in size and appearance, and you can already build in Spokane what's shown here in this graphic. There's about 21 in an average recent year that are built. And the Housing Action Plan calls for the city to revise standards for these accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, and allow for additional flexibility. So let's look at the changes. The current code cited in the very upper right-hand corner, that's that SMC citation, consistent, and that's consistent in the following slides for the other topics. And then the city is directed by the guidance that's indicated here on the lower right to make these changes. And so as far as the changes proposed, looking at how big overall the accessory dwelling units can be, what their permitted height is, and other dimensional standards. Flexibility in terms of the roof form related to the main residence, when in the case that they're detached. They can be either attached or detached, but looking for more flexibility in that the design of that second building where it is detached. And then looking to address parking requirements. So where there's currently a parking space required, looking at, and the city allows for the development to count on-street parking where it's available. Looking to reduce those further, and in some cases, and then looking also at removing an owner occupancy and covenant requirement, the covenant that is recorded on the parcel that reflects the requirement for an owner to live on the site in either of the two units. So those are the topics. In terms of exploring that owner occupancy, there's been some idea that that get phased in rather than become immediate. And then there's also conversations, of course, in the state legislature about this requirement, and in terms of how it can affect the development of accessory dwelling units and their flexibility. So that's accessory dwelling units. Moving on to the next, leaving these as a regulated housing type and looking at two different types of housing now. The different terms that apply to duplex and attached house, and kind of discussing the differences are shown here. The duplex on the left side of the street is allowed to be built now in the residential two-family zone, whereas the form of development on the right, the attached housing, is the alternative that's available both in residential two-family but also in residential single-family. But looking at that a little closer, the duplex contains two primary dwelling units on one lot, and the units share a common floor or ceiling. But then on the right side, you see the attached housing, which is in a similar building, but when viewed from above, here on the right side of the street, you see there's two or more dwelling units that are single-family residences that are on individual lots, and they're attached by a common wall at a shared property line. So you can see that in the photo when viewed from above, the property line that separates the building. And just looking at the street view of these two forms walking by, you may not be able to detect the difference between the ownership in the two cases, because they appear to be the same. So this just shows an example of these two development forms that are right across the street from each other, and how similar they look, and yet the differences between them in terms of ownership. And again, the duplex on the left is not normally allowed in the residential single family zone where the attached house is. So looking a little bit more at duplexes, the Housing Action Plan recommends exploring, expanding allowed housing types to encourage missing middle housing throughout Spokane's neighborhoods. So missing middle, that relates to the current state where there's mostly single family or apartment construction, and so what can be done to promote more variety in housing type, housing form. And proposed duplexes in more areas is sort of part of that, looking at where can we promote more variety, or what can be done. And that does propose a shift from the current exclusive single family zone. So looking at where in that single family, residential single family zone is an appropriate area, sort of the essence of the question. Now, in terms of proximity to transit, that could be part of the discussion. Required distance, for example, so it's easy to walk to transit and have that density supporting transit. Or looking at just in new developments only, so thinking of large subdivisions over X acres in size, for example, or only on corner lots where streets intersect. And so you can see the example on the right shows a case where from either street it looks similar to a single family home that might have less impact in neighborhoods that are predominantly single family, or on it could be on all lots. And then thinking about that, including updated design standards to address the neighborhood character and compatibility, including impacted vehicle access in the design and orientation of these homes, and impact to pedestrians as well as vehicles on the street in terms of parking and street trees on the street. And then, appearance to maintain that compatibility in new construction with established neighborhoods. So part of the discussion today is looking at where duplexes are appropriate. And as soon as we finish introducing these next two topics, we want to get your thought on that question. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thanks, Nate. So this project is looking at another missing middle housing type, which is attached housing. We want to allow for more housing types like this, which adds to the variety within the city. Like single family detached, townhomes are permitted in all residential zones. So with this amendment, we're looking at revising the maximum number of attached units permitted by right in residential single family and residential single family compact zones, so that a developer could build them, or rather build more than 2 attached units without having to go through the planned unit development process. Right now, it's capped, so you can do 2 attached units, and anything above that, say if you wanted to build 3, you'd need to go through a more time-consuming, more layered process of a planned unit development. Another thing we're looking at revising is design standards. So there are design standards in place currently, but we're looking at ways to de-emphasize garage dominance and multiple curb cuts in the pedestrian environment while encouraging quality design. So the rendering you see on screen shows 8 attached units, which would be permitted in the residential multifamily or the residential high density zones. All of our other residential zones would require going through a PUD if you had that many units. The last section of code related to new residential development is lot size transition. For parcels 2 acres or greater within the residential agriculture and the residential single family zones, the city requires that some of the newly created lots transition in size to complement existing lots within the neighborhood. For example, if the existing average lot size is over 7,200 square feet, then transition lots cannot be less than 7,200 square feet. If the existing average lot size is smaller and less than 7,200 square feet, then the transition lot sizes can be whatever that block average is or something larger. So you can kind of tell that our cutoff point is that 7,200 square feet that we're looking at with the existing code. So the city is discussing a range of options with the Plan Commission on how to amend this section, ranging from eliminating this requirement to revising it so the transition lots cannot be smaller than 75% of the block average, or something else entirely that could be a scaled back change to not require that lot sizing based on lots that are across right of way, which we currently do right now. They will be discussing this more at the Wednesday Plan Commission workshop that starts at 2 o'clock. But these encompass the code amendments for new residential development. And I see that there have been some questions popping up. So let's pause here and open for Q&A.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we have a few people are writing in and kind of identifying themselves, which is great.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, and then looks like there's a comment related to proximity to bike paths and safe roads for bike travel. And thinking about, especially with the growth of e-bikes and how that would be a good factor for transportation. So is that related to all of these housing types, or and I know we mentioned it for in terms of proximity to transit for duplexes in particular, and maybe somebody can address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think considering that first and last mile transit is really important. Certainly, we're trying to align the code changes with where transit service is existing, since that's an important component of, gently increasing density in our neighborhoods. I don't know that we've thought about how the code kind of interacts with things like e-bikes and whether we're requiring an offset from the front plane of the house for the garage for, say, a duplex or something like that, but it's something definitely to keep in mind.
Yeah, and then there's that impact on traffic. And so if there's new development, let's say if there's concern about a lot of new development impacting a previously established neighborhood, could it have that that effect, or what effect would that have on that required proximity to transit or some kind of non-motorized transportation?
Sorry, I'm just scrolling through our questions.
Yeah.
For what's popping up.
So there's another question. This one's more focused on duplexes and townhouses. Why do we restrict duplexes in any neighborhood? They can powerfully impact housing affordability, infill, increase the tax base, and create more walkable neighborhoods. Yeah, I think part of that is coming. Oh yeah, go ahead, sir. I was just gonna say, yeah, go ahead.
It just seemed like a lot of people don't let duplexes in their neighborhood is why I guess you're restricting them.
Thanks for that, Thomas. Yeah, so the slide that, and I can go back, but the slide that Nate showed that showed the side-by-side comparison of the street view of a duplex versus an attached home, I think kind of hits at the fact that duplexes don't need to look drastically different than what we think of as a standard single-family detached unit. There can be more support for attached homes because it is fee simple. So each unit, even if it has that shared zero lot line, shared wall, is on its own lot. So I think we're trying to highlight that they aren't really that different. And certainly we do have parts of the city that prior to certain zoning changes, they did allow for those things. And so you can see those housing types integrated into some of the older neighborhoods, and they don't really stick out that much. They can blend pretty easily.
Yeah, there's a question here about additional housing types. So I know, Amanda, you did talk about townhomes and row houses, so more than two attached in more locations. There's also a question about cottage homes, which is currently a conditional use for 4 or more cottages in single-family zones. It's also allowed in residential 2-family zone. You can do similar developments in other zones.
Yeah. Since addressing housing is so complex, Darren, to address your question, I think we're trying to eat the elephant one bite at a time. We chose code amendments that aligned really well with the existing comprehensive plan policies. And then also were directly mentioned by RCW 3670A600, which is encouraging additional construction of housing in localities across Washington. So some of those were the ones that we are tackling. So accessory dwelling units, duplexes, row houses, or attached homes. But we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg, if you will, and that we're going to be looking at further changes. So we are looking at an additional phase to try and tackle things that will likely require changes to the comprehensive plan. But what we're trying to do with this is get things that we can enact as quickly as possible. So it's not that we haven't considered or don't want to consider more. It's just we're trying to turn around quickly.
Yeah, and there's a question here about the percentage of the city's land that's currently limited to single-family housing. So this is kind of a tricky question. I guess attached housing is sometimes thought of as some cities don't allow that in some zones, and the city of Spokane does, and then also accessory dwelling units. But if we include that, we're looking at approximately, it's a majority of the city would be in residential single family and residential agricultural. And some kind of recent numbers we have are that of the residential zoned area where kind of commercial uses are more restricted, that residential single family zone is about 88% of that, or that residential zoned area. So it is a significant part of the city. Again, we do allow cottage housing, accessory dwelling units, some other forms, so it's not exclusive to single family, but does restrict things like duplex development in most areas. And in terms of the total number of housing units in the city of Spokane, there was a housing needs assessment as part of the housing action plan that identified upwards of 92,000 housing units as of mid 2020. So that's Appendix B of the housing action plan.
Just to add to what Nate said, so there's some good numbers in the supporting documents that were a part of the housing action plan. So the housing needs assessment, some research that was done by Econo Northwest as to like the share of housing type, the age of the housing stock in the city that's still available on the city's website if anyone's interested. We can also send that out to the interested parties email list that's a part of this project, but it is still up if anyone is interested. Okay, so another question. So much of the concern with many housing types is their affiliation with high turnover renters and poorly maintained properties. How can these amendments encourage homeownership even in attached units? How can the amendments encourage rental properties that are properly maintained? So what we're looking at in regard to fee simple, so attached units, we're trying to find a sweet spot where they allow greater flexibility for, say, smaller units, which smaller units are going to be more affordable. That way we're encouraging them more, streamlining the development process for developers so they can get through that. As far as encouraging rental properties to be properly maintained, I mean, certainly we're trying to get at that from the get-go by having beefed up design standards, if you will. So that way the property fits in with, you know, single family homes anyway, but also there is outdoor space for tenants or renters. As far as like maintenance, some of that is really just a dance between having good landlords and also unfortunately code enforcement if something is not being taken care of. As far as how quickly we think some of these code changes will be enacted, we're still working on getting the finalized draft. We haven't taken anything other than suggestions to Plan Commission yet. We're hoping to go to Plan Commission for public hearing this quarter. But as we work through things, both on the public engagement side and also with Plan Commission, it might be that we need to dig into a few items before they feel comfortable that it's ready to go to City Council. But right now, we're really hoping to get this to the first public hearing by the end of the first quarter and hopefully City Council early in the second quarter of this year.
Yeah, and related to that, looks like Charlie asks earlier, what impact or percentage increase in housing do we forecast these changes will have in the city? And then how are we measuring the success of these changes and what period of time? And I know we've addressed this a little bit in the Housing Action Plan Implementation Grant, right? We were forecasting, looking at other communities like Tacoma and Seattle who have made some of these changes to accessory dwelling units and seeing increases in production. So I think in Seattle it was sort of a doubling effect, and in Tacoma it was even more pronounced. So we kind of built those assumptions into that grant application and looking at a 20-year, basically a 20-year time horizon, and looking at increased production as part of that. Attached housing, you know, can only be made easier if the city allows more attached homes. That would be kind of addressing that potential barrier to limiting it to 2 outside of a planned unit development. Kind of a related question with from Darren about the consideration of Spokane having one of the lowest rates of attached housing in the nation. So that's that could be symptomatic again of the current restriction of 2 attached houses. Could also, you know, have to do with the time Spokane was developed and kind of the land available at that time. A lot of it was developed in the early part of the 20th century, so there was a lot more sort of land available than in other cities, perhaps. But looking at changing that and what needs come along with that to allow more attached housing in neighborhoods that are predominantly detached.
So to circle back about commerce grants, certainly we applied for what they are calling the Housing Action Plan Implementation Grant, which is funding some of the work on these code changes. Similarly, we applied for their grant to complete the housing action plan. And if the second phase, so to speak, of code changes aligns with any other Commerce grants, we will be applying to try and support that work. That way we're recovering for the amount of staff time and research it's going to entail. Regulations for ADUs, are the owners required to live in the ADU or just live in their primary residence? Can they rent the ADU?
Yeah, it looks like Greg answered that. They can live.
Yes, thank you, Greg.
Yeah, but as part of the proposal would be for someone, out of state to own. They could live out of state and then rent both units. So
Oh, sorry, Nate, go ahead.
go ahead.
Jessica, to address your question, so the legislature sets aside money that gets divvied to different state grants. And so Commerce, I believe last year they got over 5 million to devote to housing action plan implementation grants. So the city was one of, I think, 20 localities that got a grant in regard to implementing strategies from their adopted housing action plans. So it just sort of depends on what happens at the Capitol, like how much money gets devoted to certain things. Similarly, the city applied for a transit-oriented development grant that we were awarded in addition to this grant that was from a different pot of money, but still about housing in relation to encouraging housing around transit.
Yeah, and then Darren's comment about the different categories by Commerce. I think that's the reference to the state Commerce Department and the grant. We did apply under the categories of attached housing and accessory dwelling units. So I'm looking to increase that type of construction under that grant proposal. Did anybody have any thoughts about the proposal to remove that owner occupancy requirement? I know that's something that we're looking for more input on for accessory dwelling units. Again, with the view of increasing flexibility and increasing allowing for more production, more flexible ownership.
So Kyle asked a question about encouraging developers to do more infill instead of greenfield in the Valley, the West Plains, or Kootenai County. We're trying to be responsive to the development community about streamlining our permitting processes and the whole entirety of the development pipeline that they go through when they work with the city, while balancing the different interests, right? So in addition to working with the development community, we are also trying to be representative of residents who might, want to ensure that they still get a say in the process when it comes to development in their neighborhood. So we definitely feel that streamlining and making the process simpler should be a part of that fix, and that's what we're trying to get at with this language. We're trying to be as attractive as we can be when we consider our adjacent localities.
Yeah, there's a chance they can work well with the incentives in place too. We've talked about the multifamily tax exemption and its use in attached housing, but would need a minimum of 4 units. So if there can be code amendments that help align the built form with those possibilities. There's not much single family zone land that's part of the multifamily tax exemption, but there is some, particularly along transportation corridors like Monroe. Some questions here about short-term rentals. I know we're going to cover that in the next segment, but thinking about short-term rentals in accessory dwelling units and enforcing that. Currently the code regulates short-term rentals as a accessory residential use, and there are communities who have restricted that in accessory dwelling units and not allowed both an accessory dwelling unit and a short-term rental. So that's kind of part of the discussion. don't know if you have any more insight on that, Amanda.
I mean, we're definitely trying to bring existing units into compliance. We know that there are more than we're permitting. It's very easy to just become a host on Airbnb or VRBO, and it's becoming nationally more recognized that they definitely have an impact on housing supply. So it's an issue that we're aware of and we're trying to get in front of. As for discussion about the owner occupancy requirement for ADUs, we've put the proposal in front of Plan Commission to consider what to do with owner occupancy, and they will be discussing that further on Wednesday at their workshop. We're just sort of waiting to see, what direction they give us, but also we're trying to see, does the public want to keep the owner occupancy requirement? There's definitely some people who believe that, as mentioned by another comment, it's kind of a pride of ownership thing. People are concerned that if it's only a rental and also the primary dwelling on a lot is also a rental, that there might be some degradation in like the care and maintenance of the units. So we're just trying to find whatever that right balance is.
Hey, Nate, you are currently muted.
Hey, thanks, Tate. Tate is our planning assistant at the city of Spokane, and that's helpful. I was saying that it looks like there's some comments on both sides of that accessory dwelling unit owner occupancy issue. Dropping it would put Spokane's code more in line with state law, and there's some encouragement there to look at that question. And then another comment about dropping the owner occupancy and allowing on-street parking for accessory dwelling units. A question about insurance and lending for accessory dwelling units. In terms of I know that I have heard that construction loans can be tricky, the way that the appraisal is done for, considering that it's a single family use, and being able to have enough equity under that framework to have enough for construction of a separate residence. And then there's a comment here about looks like looking into constructing an ADU on a property, and no concerns with insurance in that case, or lending. Again, it's related to the value of the site, the appraised value overall, but that second mortgages or construction loans might be other options.
Well, and certainly I think we're trying to align the code amendments that if you are doing infill housing, you have the option to build an ADU. That way you're already constructing, it can be a part of your construction loan, and you're not then trying to build behind or to the side of a primary dwelling, which definitely gets tricky. And there is an interesting intersection between allowing accessory dwelling units to be short-term rentals. You could argue that it might be easier to kind of mitigate for the party rental effect if it's not within an entire residential unit. It's much smaller, and therefore hopefully the impact is similar on the neighborhood if there are any nuisances. We're trying to follow state guidance and also what we've seen as far as best practices from other localities across Washington. And then if they're informative, we're trying to pull examples from other states, Idaho, Montana, Oregon.
It looks like there's some more comments about underwriting new financing and insurance being limited for ADUs. So I think the proposed amendments probably only would help with more flexibility on the part of the developer. And then on the question of short-term rentals and accessory dwelling units, they should be allowed. That way owners have more flexibility. So there's that comment. And then another comment about related to accessory dwelling units and stronger landlord property maintenance laws. And yeah, requiring a minimum level of maintenance, which is, as I think you mentioned, Amanda, kind of up to the code enforcement process currently. And a comment on financing single-family residence in an ADU, not posing any issues solely based on occupancy. I saw a question from Scotty about other cities. Spokane's looked at with flexible owner occupancy requirements, and yeah, I think when looking at that state commerce grant application, we did see other cities changing their owner occupancy requirement, and then that's associated with an increase in production or an increase in construction.
So one thing to know, to kind of touch on, trying to scroll through and see who made the comment about needing to coincide these changes with more tenant landlord protection or like beefier regulations in that regard. So this is just one component. So this is just the planning services department trying to encourage more housing. There are other things that are happening at the city that aren't a part of this project. So it's something that we're aware of. So we're sort of one part of the whole that's trying to work on these issues. But this is particularly from our angle of how do we permit or encourage for the construction of more housing.
Yeah, do you think that this is a good spot to switch over to the second set of topics, and we can come back to some of these if we still have time following the discussion? Okay. And I think if you stop sharing, I can try our poll again. We just have a quick 1 minute poll, and it's still not, doesn't look like it's going to allow it. So anyhow, it was kind of a poll to see how many of the attendees were owners or renters and where located. So hopefully we can get that going for the next session. But does look like we're close to our 30 registered participants at 26 right now. So thanks for joining us again. I'll go ahead and share my screen. We'll talk about the second half of the topics, looking to talk about those permit processes, including for subdivisions up to 9 lots and short-term rentals and regulating those in more areas, as well as the environmental review thresholds for City of Spokane. So starting with short subdivision applications for up to 9 lots, those start with, they include as components land, following to the right, then in the top row there, a survey and an application, and that all leads to the public process and decision. So the public process is the focus of the change for these proposed amendments. And after preliminary approval, after that public process and decision, following on the second row, there may be construction of utilities or streets or other improvements to prepare those lots for development. And then after those are finally accepted, then that's the final plat or map of the short subdivision that's recorded with the county. And this is just one way that new sites can be prepared for residential development. You know, there's other processes such as larger subdivisions or redevelopment of existing property. So reducing the cost through the notification method of that preliminary decision, that might mean that where currently a notification map and mailing is required to nearby properties as well as a posted sign, might mean for reducing notification for 2-lot short plats, we've proposed looking at providing no notice in that case, and that would be the greatest change, but it only affects projects with the fewest lots. Or basically one additional lot is created in that case. But for short plats with 3 or more lots, the proposal is to continue a mailed notice to the notification area near that site, but then no longer requiring a posted notice sign. So that would reduce the cost of that sign. And the direction from the Housing Action Plan is to streamline and simplify the permit process as necessary. And the permitting processes for housing that expands housing options or supports a broader range of household incomes are especially being looked at, as well as just looking for continued improvements on those types of processes. So the proposed changes in this case would be to the process after the application is determined complete and has already received comments from agencies, and it would just reduce the cost of processing, and again, reducing at most where the comment period is removed in these proposed amendments for 2-lot projects only, where those fewer lots are created. So the change is scaled to the smaller projects. And by reducing processing time, such as removing notice, that would deliver a decision more quickly, and then the lots could be built on sooner. So that's the proposal in terms of notification and commenting on preliminary short subdivisions. And I think next Amanda is going to cover the next 2 topics.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
So, short-term rentals or vacation rentals, which commonly referred to by the platforms are used to book by, are allowed as a type of residential use in residential zones. And they outline renting a residential unit to a guest for a short-term use of the house for periods less than 30 nights. Code outlines 2 types of short-term rentals for our city. One is really similar to a typical use of a residential unit, a home with a couple of bedrooms, you're using the whole unit or maybe just a room or just a portion of it. And then the other type is similar to a bed and breakfast, which would have a space for, say, like a commercial meeting or a banquet, maybe related to a wedding or something of that kind of event. With this code revision, we're proposing to allow short-term rentals in any zone where residential use is permitted without that short-term rental being classified as a hotel motel use. So it would be considered, like in the residential zones, an accessory residential use. The goal here is to bring unpermitted short-term rentals into compliance. We know, like a lot of other cities, that there are more units that we are unaware of or that have not been going through the proper channels as far as permitting and business licenses than we have who are appropriately going through those channels. Bringing existing units into compliance allows the city to enforce life and safety regulations, but also recover staff costs related to permitting for these uses. And it will really help guide the city in the next phase of code changes, which will address what's the right number of short-term rentals as a percentage of our total housing supply, and what's the best code language to address those effects on the housing supply. It's been a more of a hot topic nationally, that especially in vacation or rental resort type cities, you're noticing there is a negative effect on housing supply. It's taking units out of the market for workforce housing. So this is just the start of what we're going to be doing as far as code changes related to short-term rentals. But right now, what we are really focusing on is we need to bring the units that exist into compliance. We know there are ones in our commercial zones or downtown zones. And we want to make sure that, given some tragic events that have happened nationally, that they are following appropriate building and fire code, and that they're paying the right kind of fees as far as taxes and revenue. The last permitting process and the last part of the Unified Development Code that the city is looking at amending is environmental reviews required by the State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA. So SEPA is our foundational environmental law and outlines what sort of projects must have an environmental review before permitting can be approved. The Washington Administrative Code or outlines some types of projects or activities which can be exempted from this review. When the city conducts an environmental review, a threshold determination would be issued, which kicks off a 14-day comment period. What you see on screen is a comparison of our current standards and then that maximum threshold that's permitted by WAC. So the city is evaluating whether to adopt the maximum flexible thresholds permitted by WAC, as discussed with the Plan Commission on January 12th. What this change could look like is that a 25-unit multifamily building would currently require environmental review, but under the threshold permitted by WAC, that project would be exempt from review. So no SEPA notice would be sent to agencies. There wouldn't be a site posting because it's under that threshold. This code change is much more involved than the previous ones we've discussed, if you can believe that. The WAC requires any locality that makes changes goes through a 60-day public comment period. Now that Plan Commission has provided direction on how to shape those draft changes, we're kicking off early engagement that will lead into that 60-day comment period. So part of that is we've reached out to the Department of Ecology, the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, that has informed our research and what we think are basically snippets of best code to model on, as well as processes that wouldn't be codified. So our goal with this amendment is balancing notice, protecting cultural resources, while also streamlining development to encourage more construction, because that is, again, the thing that we are trying to get at. And this is certainly echoed in our CW 3670A600, which is encouraging localities to adopt that maximum. There's some variety across the state as far as what localities are doing. There's definitely some, like the city of Everett, that have adopted the maximum. And that's something that we'll be talking to with state agencies and the tribes, not only before the 60-day public comment period, but also during that comment period. So this one's not ready to go to hearing yet, but we do still want to hear people's feedback about it. So we've included it despite its complexity. So dry, but short and sweet. We can go back to question and answer for your guys' questions. Let me just pull that up so I can see.
Yeah.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
Yeah, just some questions about allowing all zoning to be permitted, make it easier for proliferation of short-term rentals. You touched on that briefly.
Yeah, so it kind of feels like splitting hairs. So right now you could have a short-term rental in a commercial zone. The difference is that the use would be the same. Like functionally, if you were to rent it as a person coming to visit Spokane, you wouldn't know a difference. But the way that we're looking at it is while you're a hotel motel use based on your zoning district, because it's not residential in nature. So there are definitely, like I said, it's kind of splitting hairs. We're not expanding the use. What we're trying to do is say, okay, you can exist without having to go through the hotel motel development code regulations, which is in our attempt to capture those that are existing or those that might want to become short-term rentals, because we do allow for residential buildings in commercial zones, residential uses. So yes, we're trying to not necessarily expand the use, but we're trying to recognize these exist. There are different avenues to make them happen, if you will. So how do we capture that and make sure that the units are in compliance and they're going through appropriate permitting, getting their Spokane business license, and paying appropriate taxes?
Yeah, so follow up is, are we trying to capture currently permitted or not? And, I think it's a yes and kind of answer is we'd like to know the true picture, the true scope of
Yes.
this use and regulate appropriately.
Yeah, it's not a great feeling having to rely on Airbnb or VRBO to know the exact number of units. So if they're being appropriately permitted, we know the units without having to rely on either of those companies, which, as private companies have totally different interests than the city does.
There's an interesting question about upcoming proposals that might address mixed use buildings. And I don't know that we've really talked much about that. Those are typically mixed use, mixed commercial and residential, or I think in this case, residential. And mixed use development in Spokane does tend to fluctuate kind of year by year, but can produce, like I think in the recent decade, we've had as many as 60 units in 1 year in mixed use buildings. So those can tend to be more expensive and take longer than constructing just a single use residential building. But certainly all, yeah, that's definitely a different housing form that would be, something to take into consideration when thinking about housing variety.
I think in regard to mixed use buildings, we might, this is purely speculative, we might see more of that. Certainly with transit oriented development, because of the nature of being next to an arterial, you're more likely to want or need to do a mixed use building. You need that residential to try and help that high performance transit, but also while those people are away at work or school or whatever it is they do during the day, you need that captive audience of commercial, office, retail that then also gives people reason to use that high performance transit. And we're definitely trying to look at more projects like that in the city. Certainly, we're doing something with Division Connects, which is looking at the Division Ruby Couplet all the way up into the county. And then also with the STA City Line, that's something that we're looking at. Another colleague of ours in the office has been looking at a study around transit-oriented development in regard to the City Line. So that type of use is just, it's more supportive, if you will, because you're able to get more density and also those daytime uses that support when people are at work or at school.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I'd love to hear your input on, continuing to talk about these permit process topics, short-term rentals, short plats, and notification for those smaller short plat, and then also for the environmental review threshold. And it looks like there's some more comments related to other topics we can address as well.
So what about reduction or elimination of parking requirements? If the market demands off-street parking, developers will provide it, but it can kill infill projects or negatively affect walkability and quality of neighborhoods.
Yeah, again, there's kind of a transit connection there. There's an administrative waiver currently if the development proposes a transit pedestrian supported environment, and certainly proximity to transit is part of that discussion and evaluation. And I think we have seen a trend in, like, I went through the recent residential code amendments. We've seen a trend toward reducing parking requirements in proximity to transit. So I think that is being sort of reviewed and thought about each time the code's adjusted.
It's definitely being encouraged at the state level too. There's a push that if it's near transit or high performance transit, that there's a reduction or elimination of parking requirements. I think right now it seems like some of the reaction from the general public is on both sides of the fence about getting rid of parking. I know when we held some pop-up events at the winter market in December, it was a mixed bag. Some people were in favor of getting rid of parking requirements and other people were vehemently against it. I think it's threading the needle of, if we eliminate or reduce parking requirements, we have to make sure that there's not going to be a negative impact on the parking for residential uses in a neighborhood, but also to the point that it can negatively impact walkability or the urban fabric of a neighborhood. Similarly, we don't want a ton of infill or new development that puts garages and driveways as like the main piece, if you will, of a lot, because that really pokes holes in the urban fabric of a neighborhood and can be dangerous to people who are walking or biking. So we're trying to balance those two things.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing in the proposals, we're working with a consultant team on this project. So they're looking at our code, which is typically requires, for accessory dwelling units, requires one space off street. Looking at aligning that more with, for other uses, we allow on-street parking, and then where usually we have an ordinary single-family home would just require one space and then another space for every bedroom over 3. And so looking at changing parking requirements for accessory dwelling units, sort of similarly basing it on how many bedrooms. So if there's it's a studio or a 1-bedroom, then there would be no parking required. And then if there was a 2-bedroom accessory dwelling unit, then then there would be a parking space required. So like Amanda said, threading that line between more parking, or the input we're receiving on more need for continued need for parking, and then recognizing that there can be impacts on the neighborhood as well.
Since these 7 code amendments are pretty in-depth in their own right, we've tried to give an overview, but not to feel as if this is kicking the can down the road. But what I would say is that we are discussing this at the Wednesday Plan Commission, which we introduced the topic to them in December, but we're digging into this more in detail now that we've had time to work with a consultant on, like what to look at, what kind of design standards. So certainly, if you have time, if you're interested, I'd recommend, if you can, attending. If not, it's something that we'll be recording and putting up on the website so people can go back and review it. And we have the past workshops that we've done with the Plan Commission. But yes, we are looking at how to de-emphasize garage dominance for duplexes, attached homes, and then also, where it's feasible, have new development rely on alleys, with the caveat being, we couldn't expect someone who buys a vacant lot to then pave the entirety of an existing alley. That would be too onerous and unfair. But if it's existing, it's paved, then definitely we want to encourage and allow flexibility so they can then develop a lot or a series of lots that would utilize something like an alley and put that garage in the rear or off to a side, and it's not as much like a snout house.
Yeah, the snout house is where you see the first thing you see is the garage, right? And then not so much the rest of the house from the street. Want to acknowledge that previously the really great comment about going back again to financing and the different rules that apply. So I really appreciate the expertise that's shared here, and how, depending on the situation, a single family residence and accessory dwelling unit could fall into a duplex type of status, which may be a financing issue if the property were not owner occupied and recently sold comparables were difficult to come by. I think that this does tie into the discussion of a duplex being allowed in more areas. If that becomes, it's no longer a sort of a unusual or non-conforming use. If it's allowed and you begin to see a duplex as an option in more areas, that might have a positive effect as well on other forms of development. As we can see those being considered currently, where duplexes are not allowed, still being considered a type of duplex. Any other comments? Yeah, we'll provide a link to today's PowerPoint on the project webpage. That'd be great.
Yeah, so we can upload these. Alternatively, I know a couple of people have asked for them directly, so if that's your preference, we can also email it to you if you would just message either Nate or I to get contact information. That's fine. But I don't want to close things too early. Is there any other discussion, at least around permit processes or any of the other topics we've touched on?
Yeah, allowing more density on corner lots. With regard to density, the consultant team we're working with has suggested, other communities have done it a couple ways, like Spokane County, unincorporated Spokane County, on corner lots will only count that as a duplex as one dwelling unit, basically allowing for a density bonus on corner lots. And incidentally, the county is already allowing duplexes in more locations, or more broadly in more zones. As of, I think the amendments are only a couple of years old at this point. And then, as I mentioned, the consultant team has suggested a smaller approach. So if the units are limited in size, to say 1,200 square feet, then that duplex basically doesn't develop any more floor area than a single family residence would. And so being able to count that as less than a dwelling unit if it's limited in size, similar to an accessory dwelling unit. An approach in Portland and Multnomah County, Oregon, allowing a corner lot of 5,000 square feet to be divided or allow 2 units. So some of these changes in terms of density may require additional comprehensive plan amendments to sort of define what types of uses get that density bonus or where density bonuses should be allowed. So that could be a future conversation, but definitely something to keep talking about.
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to how can we course correct a large ship quickly? So we're trying to work within the land use categories and the densities that exist with the current comprehensive plan. That's not to say that with another round of code changes that we won't be looking into potential options like that. Are there any traffic calming projects that are being looked at in conjunction with infill, better sidewalks, and the swells for visibility at intersections? So for these code amendments, not that they're standalone from other things that are happening at the city, but Nate and I are very hyper focused on the right code language to allow the missing middle housing types, and then what the appropriate design standards would be to encourage quality design, try and make sure that they fit within whatever the existing neighborhood pattern is. So we're not necessarily proposing anything in regard to like offsite improvements with these code changes. That's not to say that there aren't projects within the capital improvement program that might be happening in different neighborhoods throughout the city. But looking at the intersection of offsite improvements and infill is something that we'll keep in mind as we keep going with the other code changes that we're looking at doing.
Any discussion on reducing the cost or providing support for the rehabbing, preservation of existing housing stock? I think there is quite a bit of discussion in the housing action plan in terms of the existing housing stock and opportunities for reusing existing housing stock. You know, I think these amendments are really focused more on new residential development. But certainly preserving housing is part of the supply equation. So there's a priority area in the housing action plan and strategies around preserving affordability and housing and quality to help people thrive where they live. Considerations for a number of different strategies related to that.
Yeah, and it might be that we need to highlight some programs that are like happening through other departments in the city, like CHHS, that don't necessarily address like how to change the language in the code, but are more about now that it's been changed, or you know, if it were to be changed, how do we implement that? How do we support people who are rehabbing or are say like smaller developers that do infill, more like niche construction?
Yeah. And then to Dan's question, Charlie writes more North Monroe Street or East Sprague corridor improvements planned. And I think, yeah, every time there's a arterial project rebuild, you know, we're seeing a lot of projects downtown right now that are getting, yeah, well, East Sprague being completed, but looking at some near-term work on some downtown east-west arterials. Anytime there's a arterial going through a center corridor, it's going to have that same, it's going to get that same kind of focus. So it depends on the project, but certainly there's a long list of projects planned as part of the transportation element of the comprehensive plan. And then comment about these changes first, but then that definitely helps the overall goal of enjoyment of property as these changes are implemented. I think that relates more to the preservation of existing housing and rehabilitation.
Mm. All right. Well,
Yeah, any final thoughts before we wrap? Or do you have any other topics you wanted to make sure you got input on, Amanda?
No, I think that covered. Well, hopefully that covered everyone. So if you are interested in providing public comment, you have questions that you want to further discuss with Nate or I, you can send comments to developmentcode@spokanecity.org. That's our dedicated email address for this project. Alternatively, you can contact Nate or I directly. Both of our email addresses and direct lines are on screen. And then, like I mentioned previously, that webpage is the clearinghouse for information about this. So as we start getting actual draft code, we'll be putting red lines up, and we're trying to put together some video vignettes so you can explain to your neighbor, maybe who's not a real estate agent, what it is we're talking about in regard to lot size transition, and kind of go in depth with each of the code amendments with little information fact sheets that try and address what is currently permitted or how we regulate things and how that might change, and also how that could or may not at all change the look of your particular neighborhood. So we do have another open house this week. It's on Thursday, the 27th. That one will be an evening from 4 to 5:30. And then, as I mentioned, Plan Commission is holding another workshop, which is Wednesday, starts at 2 o'clock. So our consultant team that has been working with us closely on this will be presenting the proposed code changes that are related to accessory dwelling units, duplexes, attached homes, and lot size transitions. Focused a lot on the design standard side and how that might look on any given lot. So it will be pretty interesting. They've done some great visuals. If you're interested, I'd highly encourage you to go. But if you cannot because of work, we'll be recording it and then putting it on the project webpage. And then, of course, Plan Commission and City Council will be having public hearings. We are not ready to go to that stage yet, so that is to be decided. Once those dates are nailed down, we will be putting all of the information on the website so people can plan in advance. But just want to say thanks for everyone. Really good discussion. There's some great points brought up, and more stuff for us to chew through as we try and draft these code revisions. So thanks for everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you all.